Well, good morning. This is Joanne Geer. I am the Executive Director for the Westchester Biotech Project. We're based in Westchester County, New York, which is just north of New York City, and we are leveraging researchers in discovery and clinical research and their relationships regionally, nationally, and internationally to stimulate collaborations and partnerships in biomedical research. This is a group of our partners and participants, some fantastic institutions that have supported our growth. You're here today for the Young Investigator Series, Bench to Bedside, Taking Research to Market. Throughout the process, feel free to enter any questions in the chat box. I'll be keeping track and either respond to you or we'll save your questions for the Q&A. I'm going to hand it over for the moment to Michael Welling, my co-chair, to just say a little bit about who we are and where we're headed. These are just a list of some of the things in the works. Michael? Michael, I think you have to unmute yourself. And we don't seem to have Michael, so I'm going to go right over to
Nope, I'm here.
There you are.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
All right, sorry about that. A little technical difficulties. But thank you, Joanne, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I am especially excited about today's webinar because as we've spent the last really few years trying to figure out ways for the Westchester community not only to stand itself up, but to also figure out how it can become a player in the, or a bigger player in the global biotech community. And the one thing that we've learned as we've spent time talking to those currently engaged here and those looking to is the missing piece, or one of the missing pieces, is that sort of central figure to connect all the dots. And today we're going to talk about the process of taking that idea and how to sort of manage it through the process. And certainly from our perspective, the Westchester Biotech Project, we want to help everyone and anyone we can figure out ways to navigate sort of that gauntlet. So with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and looking forward to a really exciting webinar. Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks, Joanne and Michael. We want to welcome everyone who joined us today. We're happy to have you. Today, we're proud to have Vinit Nijhawan, who's going to talk with us a little bit. Vinit is the Managing Director of the United Patent Monetization Program at UnitedLex and its subsidiary iRunway. Prior to UnitedLex, Vinit was the Managing Director of the Office of Technology Development at Boston University, where he launched 8 venture-backed spinoffs and successfully executed a patent monetization program. He teaches MBA courses on entrepreneurship at Boston U's Questrom School of Business, and more than 450 students have taken his courses. Vinit has over 30 years of experience building 5 startups. He was the CEO of 3, and all 5 were acquired. He was a co-founder of the EdTech Accelerator and Incubator LearnLaunch, and the president of the Massachusetts Association of Technology Transfer Offices. He's also on the nonprofit boards of the National Academy of Inventors and Venture Cafe. We're excited to have Vinit here today to talk with us about his experiences and give us some insights into successfully commercializing research discoveries. Thanks again, Vinit, for joining us and agreeing to share your time. And it's all yours when you're ready.
Thanks, Chris and Joanne and Michael. Really appreciate the opportunity to do this presentation. So let me just dive in. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how technology commercialization, happens in the U.S. And I'm going to start at a very high level, sort of, giving you some figures of, research funding, where it's coming from, and, how it's resulting in licenses and patents and those kind of things. So let's just dive in. Let's see if I can get this to work. There we go. So academic research in the U.S., funding for that primarily comes from the federal government. So you can see here from from these curves that the total funding, which is the top curve, it's about something in the order of a little under 70 billion a year that is coming into our research universities, both public and private research universities in the U.S. Of that, a little over half is coming from the federal government, and a good portion of that 40 billion from the federal government is coming from the National Institute of Health. The other category is increasing quite a bit, and that's primarily coming from foundations. And these are foundations such as disease foundations like the JDR, the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, and other disease foundations. They're also from family offices, that are mission driven. And then lastly, companies also fund research at universities. So that's been relatively flat over the last 30 years. You saw that growth curve increasing quite a bit from 1991 to 2015. That's great news. The not so great news is that over the past 5 years or so, research funding to universities has been flat. And that is something new. Research funding to universities began after the Second World War. And, we've had a 60-year run of increased research funding year after year. But that's flattened out a bit now. And it's flattened out both because the federal government, is under pressure because of our national debt to reduce expenditures. And as I mentioned, industry, has pretty much been flat for the last 30 years. And though foundations are growing, they really are not replacing kind of the flattening of the federal government curve. So this is good and bad. I think the good part of it is that other countries are stepping up. So you're seeing research funding of academic institutions going up in other countries, even though we're flat, which is fine, because ultimately the technologies that get created benefit people everywhere in the world. So so all this research funding that's coming into our universities, some of it results in inventions that are created and then filed for, what we call invention disclosures. That's the top line here, the red line. These are invention disclosures that research faculty are submitting to the Tech Transfer Office because they feel like they have something that could be patented. And then the bottom line are the patent filings that result from those invention disclosures. Clearly, not every invention disclosure results in a patent finding, and that's what the Tech Transfer Office does, is decide which ones that are that make sense to file on. And by make sense, I mean, to patent something, it has to be novel, it has to be something unique, and it has to be something that hasn't been done before. And so the Tech Transfer Office tries to determine that before they file for a patent. And those patents, once they're granted, are then licensed out to industry. And by industry, I mean both kind of existing companies as well as to startup companies that are spun out of the university. So that little line at the bottom, the purple line, are the licenses and options that are being executed every year by universities. And the top line are the cumulative active licenses. Of course, when you license a patent life is 20 years. So when you license it out, you're licensing it out hopefully for the life of the patent. And that's why the cumulative number keeps going up, because it's only after the patent expires after 20 years that then those licenses become invalid. Of all the licenses that are out there, the middle line really shows you the ones that are yielding royalty income of some kind to the university. So when you license a patent out or an invention out to a company, they spend a number of years developing that into a product, and then they start selling the product. Once they start selling the product, then the royalties from those sales come to the university, and those royalties are usually pretty small, like a few percentage points at most on sales. So that's why you see the active royalty-bearing licenses are much lower than the cumulative licenses. But again, these have been increasing year after year after year. A lot of this is a result of a law that was passed in 1980 called the Bayh-Dole Act, which basically gave the ownership of patents that were obtained from federal research funding by a university to the university. In other words, the university was now given ownership. Before that, it was the government that owned these patents, and the government really wasn't good at commercializing. So Congress passed this law, the Bayh-Dole Act, that said, hey, universities, you can now own these patents, but you have an obligation to try to commercialize them. And the results actually have been very, very positive. So you can see from this chart that the gray part of the bar are royalties, and that the royalties sort of emerging, from the patents that are being licensed have been increasing year after year after year. The orange part is equity. So when you license it to a startup, the university will usually take some equity in the startup as well. But you can see equity is a very, very small part of the revenue that's coming back from these patents. The majority of it is coming from royalties. And again, you can see that it peaked in 2008 and then sort of dropped down because of the recession. But the good news is it's coming back up again. So this gives you an idea of what's happened over just the past 5 years. And you can see in 2016, licensing income jumped up to $3 billion. Not quite the peak in 2008, but it's starting to come back. And so this is pretty significant. I mean, $3 billion a year that's flowing back to universities. And usually, most universities have a patent policy that takes that royalty and splits it up into three. So a third of that goes to the inventors of the patent. So faculty members are getting, $1 billion a year from their inventions, in addition to their salaries. And then about a third goes to the department that the faculty members in, or the research group. And then the third goes into the general university fund. And, that's been a very virtuous cycle that's been going on now for a good 40 years. But here's an important takeaway, that only about 0.5% of these active licenses generate more than $1 million a year in royalties. So in 2015, we had 45,000 active licenses, of which 222 were generating more than $1 million a year in royalty. So it's a very hit-driven kind of industry, where it's a handful of patents that generate most of that $3 billion in royalty. The majority of patents generate very little in royalty. That doesn't mean that they're not having an impact on society. They are being commercialized. It's just that the sales of the products that are coming out of that patent are not that significant. And so the question is, what are these hits? And many of them are coming out of startups, and many of them are coming out of new drugs. And I'll show you an example of that in a second. So if you look at just startups, the middle line talks about the number of startups that have been formed coming out of universities that are licensing patents from the universities. So that's been increasing steadily from, a little under 700 in 2011 to over 1,000 in 2015. Of those, the orange line below are the ones that stay stay in their home state, and that's about 73%. So, so you can see that startups that are coming out of a university have a big impact on the local economy. And to give you an example of both of those, startups as well as hit-driven, so in Stanford, in 40 plus years of doing tech transfer and over 9,000 patents that have been generated at Stanford, which have resulted in, you know, $1.8 billion in cumulative royalty over those 40 years. 2/3 of that royalty revenue came from these 4 patents or inventions. The first one, functional antibodies, resulted in a company called Genentech, which was one of the very early biotech companies. And then, you know, these others, you know, also resulted in startups, and probably the one that everybody recognizes the most is Google, which, you know, resulted in $340 million to the university, mainly through equity that the university owned in Google. So it's really a hit-driven kind of industry, and you know, and what that suggests is that it's important to always not just have a big funnel of things coming in, but to also have a supportive environment, because you never know which one of these inventions will become a hit. About 1/3 of patents that are filed get licensed within the first 5 years of their life. 2/3 end up sitting on the shelf at universities and are unlicensed. And what universities are increasingly beginning to figure out is that those 2/3 that are sitting on the shelf are worth coming back and looking at once in a while, because partly the reason that they were put on the shelf was that the market wasn't ready for them when, you know, when the patent was received. And now they're put on the shelf and the market catches up, and suddenly there are people practicing the patent. And if the university can discover if somebody's practicing their patent, they can go to those people and say, look, you're practicing the patent that we have, you know, you need to license this from us. And in many cases, those companies will resist, and your only option is to sue them. And that's what patent enforcement is. And universities are increasingly doing that. And you can see from these, you know, from this, you know, from this chart, that the reason universities want to do that is because they want to, you know, they want to sort of back their faculty members who've done the invention and you know, support them and have them receive royalties, you know, from these companies that are practicing their inventions. They also want to discourage what's known as efficient infringement. So a lot of companies, especially in the tech industry, these are companies like Google and Apple and Facebook and others, have realized that universities are not going to enforce their patents, and therefore, you know, they just, you know, continue to practice these patents and wait for a university to come to them. And so it's important for universities now to assert on their patents, and increasingly they're doing so, and they're also very successful. So a university is a non-practicing entity, you know, and if you look at non-practicing entities, companies, universities, or individuals, universities have the largest settlements at around 16.3 million on average, and have the highest success rate. Close to half of the enforcement that universities have brought have resulted in settlements with significant royalties coming back to the university. So how do universities do this commercialization? They do it through an organization called the Tech Transfer Office, the TTO. And the Tech Transfer Office has people, and these people usually have strong technical backgrounds and strong business backgrounds. So, you know, they could have PhDs and MBAs. And what they do is they take invention disclosures, they file patents, and then they try to license their patents. And so if you look at sort of the size of these tech transfer offices, they're usually pretty small. So if you look at this distribution, you know, Most of the tech transfer offices out there are smaller than 5 people. There are very few. There are only 13 that are bigger than 3 dozen people. So they're very small and usually overworked, because if $66 billion in research is resulting in 5,000 or 6,000 patents being filed every year across the country, it's just a handful of people who are doing that. So you can see from the top graph, even though the tech transfer offices have grown quite a bit, where they're now close to 2,500 people in tech transfer offices across the country, they're still dealing with a very large volume and also a huge distribution of technologies. So it's hard to cover every technology that's that research is being done at universities. But this gives you a sense that it's a very difficult job as a tech transfer officer to try to find things that are worth patenting and licensing. So let me now talk about Boston University. So Boston University is the 4th largest private university in the U.S. It has an engineering school that really started becoming more of a research school in the early 90s, started giving out PhDs. So started as a liberal arts school and increasingly is becoming a research university, has a medical school as well, and has a research funding base of somewhere around $400 million a year. And the American Association of Universities is a very small club that was started over 100 years ago, and BU was accepted into that membership back in 2012, which is the first private university in about 18 years to join, which really talks about the strength of BU as a research university. So when I came in to run the tech transfer office there in 2000, I really didn't know much about tech transfer. So I started looking across the country and realized that the model that mostly everybody was employing was what I call a market push model, where these inventions disclosures were coming in, we filed patents, and then we tried to license patents, and this funnel really depended on the tech transfer office making decisions on what I call to pick winners. And it's really hard to do because the technology is so early. You don't have the right kind of people because there's so many different types of technologies, and you just don't have the resources to support everybody. You just don't have the large enough patent budget or enough funding to support everybody. And then of course faculty somehow feel that the tech transfer office is favoring some winners and not themselves. And then on the flip side, industry, who you're trying to license to, has a lot of options. There's lots of universities that are calling on them. Industries also have this perception that universities are very difficult to do business with. And then your last option, which is to do a startup, the scarce resource always is experienced startup executives, especially when you're in regions outside of Boston and Silicon Valley and New York. You just don't have those experienced startup executives, and you also don't have venture capital, in those regions. So John Seeley Brown, I had the pleasure of being on a panel with him once, and he made the comment that most inventors think that 99% of the work is doing the inventions, and faculty are no different. They feel that once their invention's been patented, then really the market should just pick it up. The reality is really the other way around, where the invention is 1% of what needs to be done. You have 99% of the work that still needs to be done to bring it to market, and that's that's always very difficult for universities to understand and figure out and gather resources to do. So I looked at how our tech transfer office was operating, and I created this, what I call a data flow diagram, as a good software engineer. And so OTD was our Office of Technology Development, and the thickness of the lines here are the amount of communication that's happening with different parts of our ecosystem. Obviously, our communication with our faculty is the biggest line, because we're we're always talking to them, encouraging them to do invention disclosures. And then the next biggest line is the outreach to business. Because we're trying to license things, and you want to be connected to business. And then there's a thick line to service providers, mainly to law firms, because we use outside law firms for filing patents and for helping us do license agreements. And then lastly, there's a line to university administration, because there's always this overhead that the university always wants to encroach upon what you're doing. So when I looked at this, it became pretty clear to me that it was not a pipeline and funnel model. This was more of a platform model. So how does this place connect faculty to business in a more efficient and more scale way than trying to curate everything that's coming in? And so that's why I created this model called, I gave it a motto: maximize collisions, minimize friction, which, by the way, is exactly what a platform does, right? So a platform like Uber or Airbnb does exactly that. They maximize the connections between demand and supply, and they become really easy to do business with by creating very simple, easy to use apps. And so we did the same. We sort of looked at tech transfer as a platform and said, could we sort of, increase the number of connections between our faculty and industry and become a lot easier to do business with? And that's what we implemented, over a period of a few years. And I'm not going to go through this slide in a huge amount of detail here, but you can see that we did a bunch of things. We sort of created a new organizational structure, and it was business development group, a transaction group that we call IP and licensing, an operations group, and a new ventures group. And the business development group really was focused on making those collisions between faculty and industry. The IP and license group was really about reducing friction and making all the agreements that you have to do to make this happen, whether they're confidentiality disclosure agreements, material transfer agreements, licensing agreements. There's a lot of agreements that one has to do to make those efficient and quick. And the operations group just made sure that it was like a startup, so all the HR functions and internal office functions worked well. And then we went into sort of doing what I called fewer but better. We just had a limited patent budget, so we used those collisions to get industry to inform us about which things looked more interesting and backed those. We also created this thing called a 6-year rule, that if something wasn't licensed in 6 years, then it really was, we needed to monetize it in some way or kill it. And so we were able to actually rationalize our inventory by really killing a lot of patents that didn't look like they were going to get licensed at all, and freeing up money to invest in new things. And then we did a major focus on startups, because ideally you'd like to license to a company, but companies are not always aligned with with your invention for many reasons. And that's when you do a startup, when you think that startup is a bridge to the company. And to do startups, you really have to sort of organize them to get the right entrepreneur in, to bring in capital, to help support both of them with students who help, with business plan development and things like that. So we created kind of this active, model to do startups, which was very successful. We launched over 8 venture-backed startups in those 5.5 years, who've raised over 150 million in venture capital so far. And then, as I mentioned, we sort of really reduced friction by creating kind of standardized agreements. We put in a new IT system. We created these sort of new metrics. On the maximized collision side, we started doing some outreach. We didn't have a mailing list before I got there. We created a mailing list. We created this annual conference called Tech, Drugs, and Rock and Roll, which we did in the summer, made it kind of like a fun trade fair with screens, and we showed off all our technologies. And it went from, you know, nothing to 900 people every year. Started a newsletter, which, you know, goes out to about 35,000 people, over a 22% open rate. Used social media, and also on the faculty side, you know, started reaching out to faculty, created an Innovator of the Year award, which we gave away at Tech, Drugs, and Rock and Roll every year, and that became very coveted. Created, you know, a commercialization boot camp. I also, you know, teach at BU, and I created a tech commercialization course called iTeams that, you know, there was an iTeams course taught at MIT that I thought was really effective, and created a version of it at Boston University. And all, so basically it takes a lot of things. There's no one silver bullet. You have to do a whole bunch of things. And all those things sort of resulted in, this is the revenues on the right-hand side. It takes a while. It took 5 years of doing these things before our revenue started jumping up. Now I'm going to walk you through a couple of startup case studies just to show you how active one has to be in order to get these companies off the ground. So this first one is a company called BetaBionics. Our principal investigator, or the faculty member, is this engineering professor, Ed Damiano. Ed's son was discovered to have type 1 diabetes, you know, when he was in elementary school. And Ed, you know, is a big impact for any of you who have children who have type 1 diabetes. You know, it's a major life-changing event, not just for the child, but also for the family, because, you know, you have to, you know, constantly measure the, you know, blood glucose level, and, you know, inject insulin in irregular times, watch what you eat, all those things. And Ed decided that by the time his son went to college, which by the way is going to be a couple years from now, that he's going to have a solution that, you know, his son can carry on him, that automatically measures blood glucose level and automatically injects insulin and glucagon, which is the opposite of insulin. So to manage, you know, to manage the blood glucose level. And so he sort of single-handedly started getting funding internally, both from the federal government and from foundations. That's what non-dilutive funding is. Non-dilutive means that, you know, there's no equity associated with it. So he raised over $8 million. Now it's even more than $8 million in non-dilutive funding to develop it in the labs. And then eventually launched a company called BetaBionics, and has raised $5 million, actually more than $5 million to date, from companies and individuals to bring this product to market. And he initially did a clinical trial with summer camp students, specifically for type 1 diabetes summer camp students. And he's been doing that now for a few years. We supported him obviously by patenting, you know, his algorithms that he developed, and you know, helped him with his business planning. And we had this gap funding called the Coulter program at BU, and the Coulter program gave him some key funding at key times. And we've also helped him with kind of management team issues and things like that. So hopefully Ed's going to be able to achieve what he set out to do, is to have a product for his son by the time his son hits college a couple years from now. So the next company, Constant Therapy, is a digital health company that we launched out of our Sergeant's College of Rehab. So Swati Kiran had come up with this concept of using, so people who've had stroke particularly lose their ability to speak, and she had this speech therapy concept to bring speech back, but it was very manual, where you did it with sort of cards, like you showed an apple and the person had to say apple, and they did that in the office every once a week or something like that. We took that whole concept and we put it into an app and connected to the cloud, so that patients were now able to do this at home more regularly and more often. Plus, because it was done and software in the cloud, we were able to use AI to personalize for each person. So the AI would adjust the level of difficulty up and down depending on how a person was doing. And we were able to launch this company, and it's now had over 30 million tasks completed on its system. And the company was recently acquired by another company in San Diego. So we helped it all the way, both with a launch award. So this was actually a gap fund that we controlled, that we invested in from an equity perspective. We helped find the CEO, give it a Coulter Award. It was the first Coulter Award given to a digital health, to an app, not to a medical device. And it's been very successful, helped, tens of thousands of patients regain speech and gait faster than they could have if they went and did rehab the old way. And the last company, it's a very prolific PI who we have named Jim Collins. Jim is now actually at MIT and very prolific over there as well. And he was a leader in this field called synthetic biology, where you're engineering, biology, you're engineering cells. And one of his inventions was to engineer this bacteriophage. So bacteriophage, so if, when you wake up in the morning and, that sort of crud on your teeth that you brush away, that's bacteriophage. So it's what's known as, that's biofilms. And the only way to break up biofilms today is by scraping. So Jim figured out that he could use bacteriophage, which is a type of bacteria that you could engineer to break up biofilms. And by the way, biofilms, accumulate everywhere there's any liquid. So not just in your mouth and teeth, but also in oil pipelines or in HVAC systems, or in food processing plants. And so we started this company initially to focus on the industrial market. And then, when we went to the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, they didn't know how to regulate us. And it looked like there was too much uncertainty. So we pivoted and focused on the food testing market. So I don't know if you've been following, but foodborne illnesses are becoming a big problem in our food supply chain, mainly because of these biofilms. And so we engineered this bacteriophage to be able to detect, using optical means, if there was a bad bug, in a food processing plant. And up till now, the only way you can detect that was the same way you detect strep, by doing kind of a swab, sending it to a lab, growing the culture, and then you would find out a couple of days later when you had the bad bug in your food processing plant. But meanwhile, you were already, shipping all this food and people were getting sick. So we found a way to do it where we could measure this stuff in 3 or 4 hours in the plant. And so then you could take measures to not ship the food and to clean up the plant. And again, this was a business plan winner at our Boston University business plan competition. We gave it a launch award of $150K. It was an Innovator of the Year award. We recruited the CEO. So very active things that we did to help this company get off the ground. And it's raised now more than, it shows 16 million here. They've actually raised a Series C. So they've raised, over 20 million to date and have product in the marketplace.